Okay, so thanks very much, Eva. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Today I want to talk about something that concerns my team and me in Hamburg a lot, and that is how to bring ethics into the development of AI and make it even better. And I want to start with a picture that many or maybe all of you know, and that is, let me see if I can get there, and that is this one. So look into that man's face. You see a bit of surprise, maybe, consternation, despair. Of course, it's March 2018, and you see Lee Sedol, the world champion of AlphaGo. And as you know, on that day, he didn't play against a human, but against AlphaGo, an AI. And it was such a landslide moment because AlphaGo, the game of Go was thought to be uncomputable. You know, the possible configurations on the board exceed the number of atoms in the world. So how could a computer ever learn, or an AI system, to play that game? But as you know, in the end, the AI won, and there's a very emotional movie about that day. And I bring up that particular example not only, or not primarily, because it is one of the things that we thought were exclusively within the human domain, but also, as Lee Sedol said in the video, it kind of changed how he thinks about creativity and intelligence. So in the movie, he says, you know, what he thought was creativity, he now thinks to be mere convention after playing against the AI. And so I want to dig a bit deeper into these things where we thought, you know, an AI would never be able to do those things, and ask how they might change fundamental notions of human experience and agency. And often when we think about these kinds of things, people, at least outside the academic bubble, ask, well, why should we think about ethics in that context? I mean, with this kind of audience, with you in the audience, there isn't, you know, at least one part where I don't have to say much about it. I don't have to say much about why the consequences of using AI can be morally very significant. I don't have to say much about how the development of AI, coding AI, testing AI has ethical dimensions. But today I want to highlight maybe an underappreciated aspect of why ethics is key to these kinds of applications. And that is the process of making these systems smart in the sense in which we use that word, or making AI intelligent, whatever that means in detail. So I want to show, or kind of start with the idea that ethics plays a role in making the system smart, and that there's a very interesting connection between ethical principles and intelligence. And so that leads me to the core idea for today, something that I want to walk you through and discuss with you, and that is the idea of what I call deep ethics. So deep ethics is the following. No, you can't see that properly, right? No. That's not good. Is there something wrong with the projector, maybe? I think if you just adjust it a little bit, then you might be. Yeah. Look, the analog world plays a role.
So we still have stuff which is okay.
Okay. That's perfect. Yeah, that's really good. So a quick overview of what I mean by this. It's a methodological framework for ethics by design with two central ideas. So many of you have heard of ethics by design or value-sensitive design. So the idea that ethics cannot be or must not be an afterthought, but be integrated into all phases of developing artificial intelligence. And this is kind of the starting point. So I want to think about ethics in the technology, in the AI development, rather than as an external assessment that comes afterwards, and pursue that in particular with two central components. So one is the translation of qualitative ethics into quantitative metrics. So by that I mean that, you know, ethical principles often come in terms of, as I said, principles, narratives, ideas. It's very general if you think of justice, human autonomy, fairness. It doesn't really come in terms of numbers already. But when we think about how to train an AI system, often we require mathematical formula, something more quantitative, to bring the information into the AI system. So one thing that deep ethics will try to do, potentially in a novel way, is to get to that translation from ethics, which is abstract, general, indeterminate, to the things that work well in AI training, numerical, quantitative, precise. So how can we make that transition? There are different bits in the literature that have tried this in various ways. So when we think about economics, the philosophy of economics, cost-benefit analysis, qualis, but I want to suggest a new way of doing that. And the second component is what I call the non-neutrality of intelligence. You might all have heard about the non-neutrality of technology, starting in the 70s or even earlier. So the idea that a technological artifact is never ethically or morally neutral. It always embodies some values, gives particular affordances, makes things easier to do, harder to do, or leads to other morally significant consequences. So it's a thesis that says it's not just about how we use technology that brings in the moral or ethical component, but it's also already in the design of the technology, by which I mean more specifically the technological artifact. So I want to kind of take that as the basis, but push it a bit further and think about intelligent, smart technologies. So what's the process of making what we call an AI system smart or intelligent, where it might differ from, let's say, a hammer or some kind of other non-smart technology. And I want to say that in that way, we can also think about the smartness or intelligent in a non-neutral way. When I say intelligence, I won't be able to rely on a unanimously agreed definition because there's still much disagreement about what that really means. You can take as a starting point maybe things that kind of were prevalent in some bits of the alignment literature, where it's about means-end reasoning, instrumental rationality, but it doesn't really matter. What I want to avoid at this point is what Herbert Hart called a definitional stop. I won't give you a firm definition of intelligence to avoid ignoring things that might still be relevant at the periphery. So think of it as a family resemblance term having instrumental rationality at its core, but wouldn't necessarily preclude other things. And this is an interesting aspect because it connects to some emerging or burgeoning parts in the literature in neuropsychology, neuroscience as well, where people thought about what's the connection between humans becoming intelligent and humans acquiring some kind of ethical capacities. And when you think about how we grow up as humans, children, we're not like first become super logical, super smart, reason, and at some point, let's say age 10, there's like the moral ethical capacities that are added on top of it. That's not how it works. Much of our smarts wouldn't make indeed much sense if we didn't think about our sense of fairness, our sense of what we owe other people in a certain interaction, particularly when it comes to cooperating with others. And there's some indicative research that shows if people lack these ethical capacities, if they can't understand notions of fairness, they have lower problem-solving capacities across the board. So what that says is not that you can't be highly intelligent and ethically deficient. That's possible. You can be a villain and very intelligent. You can also be a moral saint and very intelligent, but what it says is you can't be a moral nobody and be very intelligent. And this is what I think is true not only of humans and how we grow up as humans, but potentially also for other forms of intelligence that we see in AI systems or computers. So that is the idea. Something that is well known in the literature, ethics by design, value-sensitive design, and then these two columns, these two great ambitions that I try to put forward and maybe use them and integrate them into that field. I called it deep ethics provisionally because of the connection maybe to deep learning. So this is one reason, and also because of this fundamental connection between ethics and intelligence that interests me here. So this is where the term comes from, or why I thought it might be appropriate. Okay, so that's the plan for the talk for the day, and I want to walk you through an example and show how it might work. And I want to start with this guy. So this is our dog in Hamburg. Monty, I think is his name. I call him Sparky now. He's on campus. And suppose you want to teach him a trick like fetching a ball. And whenever he gets it right, you give him a treat. And the closer he gets to do that perfectly, the more treats he gets. Psychologists call this operant conditioning. This is how animals learn, how we learn as well. It's not like learning with a teacher. You won't explain it. It's more like learning with a critic who says boo or hurrah whenever the behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. But it's very effective with animals. And there's a very interesting connection between the history of psychology, learning, neuroscience on the one hand, and the history of computer science and particular techniques of machine learning on the other hand. So what works for Sparky, the dog, is also a model when we think about teaching this guy, Spooky. So think of that as just as a visual representation of some kind of smart system. And I want to talk about how that system might learn. So suppose the system starts moving around randomly in a virtual environment. And whenever it performs some kind of conduct or behavior that we think is valuable, we give it a digital treat or a bonus or a reward. So think of, there's a reward function in the background, and whenever I get something right, there's the feedback that this was good, and there's a reward. I don't want to suggest that a computer system feels anything, savors the treat, has sentience, but I want to say that there is a parallel between operant conditioning in psychology and reinforcement learning in machine learning. And this is the parallel that I want to exploit. So to investigate and explore deep ethics, so let's analyze the case that I shall present in a moment with that application from reinforcement learning. So the type of machine learning where the agent learns through trial and error, receiving rewards or penalties for his action. And central to these techniques are so-called reward functions that model the amounts of rewards that the agent receives for the conduct. So I'm going to simplify things for the following reason. I don't want what I'm going to say to be relevant only to a very particular and tiny niche within machine learning. I want it to be representative for a much wider set of questions. In practice, the things will be much more complicated. So when we think about Markov decision processes and other ways of using reinforcement learning or deep reinforcement learning and the fine-tuning of models, that will be more complicated. But I want to simplify things to make the point more fundamental, to show that at a very fundamental and general level, the core claims of deep ethics, like translating the qualitative into the quantitative and the intelligence aspect, are relevant there as well. So don't think of that as a representation of what's going on in practice, really. But I do want to claim, as a complete description of what's going on, but I do want to claim that it is accurate as a more general representation. So as a case study, consider the allocation of beds in an intensive care unit. So just last year, there was a study that showed again that the medical team can be quite overwhelmed when resources like hospital beds are scarce and there's very little time to make a decision. So we saw that during the pandemic a lot, where medical doctors had to make very quick decision who should get a bed in hospital and who could be treated as an outpatient. How serious is it with that particular person? Can we send them home? Should we leave them here? And people had to take in loads of information to make that decision. That can be quite hard. So the question is, could we have an AI to help us with that decision, give a recommendation, and do that? And in that case, then the question would be, what should be the reward function for the AI system, the function that assigns a score to a patient based on their risk, to guide that bed allocation in a line with, and that aligns with ethical and practical constraints. And on a very general level, we could think of that question, in terms of finding a function in that coordination system. So you see, I hope you can read that, the risk levels there. So how risky is the condition of a particular patient? What's the risk level of them suffering adverse health effects if they're not admitted to the hospital? And then on the other axis, you could see maybe the safety reward, the score, that the AI system would receive by pushing that person up the rank, prioritizing them, and giving them a particular score on the hospital allocation. Again, a very simplified way of looking at it, but we might want to have some kind of function that kind of assigns a safety reward dependent on the risk level, or like a priority score dependent on the risk level. And at this level of generality, it's not really tied to the hospital setting. We can also think about autonomous driving, where it's also about how risky it is to speed up, and we also have efficiency. So any kind of AI system that is in the area where both efficiency and safety play a role, that is applicable to what I'm saying today. I just use the hospital case as an illustration, but it works for other things as well, from autonomous driving, recommender systems, to gaming even. And so the question I think that we need to ask ourselves, what are some of the relevant ethical principles when we want to make that decision, deciding who ought to get a hospital bed or not? And I identified a couple of, maybe 4 of them, to guide our reasoning. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I think they are certainly relevant. And they are taken from the principalist approach in biomedical ethics made famous by Beecham and Childress. So, of course, there's first the principle of beneficence that describes the moral obligation to protect and promote the good of others, emphasizing actions that contribute to their welfare. As medical doctors, people have to, promote their patients' health, their good. Not just not to harm them, but also try to provide a benefit. That's why we go to the hospital. That's why we see doctors. And even if, in real life, our own obligation to do good for others might be much lower, maybe we only have an obligation not to interfere with their lives, that is one ethical principle that is certainly true in the medical area. And arguably, it is also true when we think about mobility solutions with AI. But then, obviously, we are dealing with risks of harm and other things that could go wrong. So another ethical principle that we should consider is the precautionary principle. So that asserts that in the face of potential harm to human health, and when knowledge is incomplete, actions should be taken to prevent or mitigate such harm. Often you might say, well, better be safe than sorry. And find a principle, a systematic way to deal with a situation where you're not quite sure what will happen, but you still need to make a call. And there are risks of harm in particular ways. Something that's been heavily discussed, and I was involved in that literature as well, is responsibility, which can describe 2 things. So first, the conditions under which people can be held to account for their conduct retrospectively. But it also focuses on the obligations we have towards others prospectively. So responsibility could mean something like, something good or bad happened, and then you can say, okay, that person or institution was responsible for it. We can ask them, why did you do this? And maybe even blame them or apply legal redress in the end. But when we use the word often in the plural, our responsibilities, we have this forward-looking perspective. Obligations, what are the responsibilities of the medical team? What kind of obligations do they have towards their patients? And we want a clear assignment of these of responsibilities so understood, and thereby avoid the infamous responsibility gaps. So situations where AI does things, but it seems that no one is responsible for it. And that is practically bad because it's not a very palatable situation. But it seems also theoretically weird, because how could it ever be the case that we deliberately design a technology, put it into practice, but then no one is responsible when things go wrong? And then finally, we need to think about justice that asserts that limited resources must be distributed equitably, and that cases with only marginal differences are not treated in drastically disparate ways. Now we have a case about hospital beds. It's a scarce resource. Many people want them maybe. How are we going to make sure that whatever we distribute will be in accordance with principles of justice? Not an exhaustive list, but I think this is the starting point. This is what we need to take into account. Good. So we've got the case, how to distribute hospital beds. We want to train AI with reinforcement learning to help us with that. Find a kind of function that sets into relation the risk and the safety, and find ways to exercise this deep ethics framework. So remember, as an ethics by design framework, so we need to get into the development of the AI. We need to find a way to translate these very qualitative, abstract, general principles into something more mathematical, maybe, that is more amenable to the reinforcement learning process. And we want to see, and this is, I think, maybe the most original part of that idea, we want to see how ethics shapes intelligence, so that it can't be the case that you're intelligent but ethically neutral. And just to make this distinction one more time, because it is really important for my talk. When I say intelligence can't be ethically neutral, I'm not saying you can only be intelligent if you're morally good. You can be morally bad and very intelligent, but you can't be a moral nobody. You can't be like a glass of still water and still be very intelligent. You have to have some kind of profile. And if that's true, that is, I think, a very strong and very interesting claim. Okay, so let's think about how to translate those ethical principles into mathematical requirements. So when we start, there are a couple of things that seem very obvious. If there is no risk whatsoever, we don't want to give out any safety reward. We don't want to reward the system for admitting the patient if there is no risk whatsoever. So we want to have 0-0 right at the beginning. It seems it also makes sense that we want to have the maximum safety reward if there's the maximum risk. So we don't want lower safety rewards if there's 100% risk or 99% risk of things going seriously wrong if we don't admit the person to the hospital. And it stands, it's a common sense assumption that in the middle there should be monotonicity. So we can't have, a wave function there where, let's say, the risk levels get higher, but the safety reward gets lower. So we want these three assumptions. And so it's a linear function if we only have those three. But this is not the only function that would satisfy these three requirements. There are many more that would satisfy them. And they don't necessarily differ in terms of technical feasibility, or they don't necessarily differ in terms of mathematical desirability, but they hugely differ in terms of their ethical profile. And if that is true, and that function plays a role in reinforcement learning or the Markov decision processes, then you can see that kind of pushing those systems towards greater smartness or intelligence necessarily involves that ethical profile. So let me start maybe with an alternative, what we might want at the beginning and what might not be so good with the red line, the linear function. So I would suggest we should start with something that looks more like a skateboard ramp at the beginning. So a convex start where, again, the first derivative stays positive because we want it to have monotonicity, but the second one also that we get that particular shape. Why? Because at the beginning, when we prioritize patients with very low risk in the first interval, we might waste resources. They don't really need it. What's worse, we might even harm them because unnecessarily hospitalization could also lead to harming patients and their interest. So the difference between the red and the green line isn't so much a difference in terms of efficiency, feasibility, or mathematics, but it's a difference in ethical judgment. And if we think about beneficence as our obligation to protect and promote good, then we don't want to waste resources and we don't want to increase risks that come from unnecessary hospitalization. So I think at some point we might want to talk about the exact interval, but at some point we want to have the convex start and not the linear function. To say, hold your horses, don't prioritize them too early. Now, I think at the...
What are the axes again?
So this is the risk level, and this is the reward that they get for prioritizing the patient. Yeah. At the end, we might want to have the opposite. We might think that the linear function, doesn't get to the maximum reward for safety quickly enough. So maybe the precautionary principle, better be safe than sorry, says that we want a concave ending. So that within a particular interval, we keep the first derivative positive, but turn the second one negative, so that we have kind of the umbrella shape, rather than the skateboard ramp shape. And again, I don't think, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, I don't think from a mathematical or technical perspective, there's any significant difference between red and green. But from an ethical perspective, there is, and that is the extent to which you emphasize a precautionary principle. And that might depend on context again. You know, if you think about hospitals or mobility, where safety is of the essence, or if you think about gaming, where a kind of an analog situation might just determine the level of difficulty of playing the game. So it'd be very different. So it might be that in a different context, you might want to go with the convex shape all the way through. But in that context, where there's significant risk of harm, I would argue there is a precautionary principle that requires the opposite. You do not need to agree with me that this is the right way to go. You might have, you know, an exponential function, something that looks different. But the point just is that whatever you think is the right function implies an ethical judgment, not just a technical or mathematical one. So this is the point. You can completely disagree with the green line. You can also say the red line is just fine. But I just want you to see that there's an ethical difference. So now we just, you know, connect the dots and get this nice sigmoid function already. And for reasons of responsibility, this is also an interesting thing to have. So when we think about, do we want to have a continuous function or discrete function, there are some mathematical reasons to want to have a continuous function that we can differentiate at any point, but also in terms of responsibility. So one thing philosophers have thought about is the so-called epistemic condition of responsibility, which roughly says you can be responsible for an outcome only if you could reasonably foresee that outcome. You know, details matter. So if you use an AI system, you know, as a recommender system, you interact with it, it's obviously very conducive, not just for safety and human oversight, to know what might happen if you do this or that, but it also makes it much easier for you to foresee what could happen. So I shall bracket concerns about opaque and black box AI for a moment, but this is one way to enhance explainability and the understanding of how systems work. And you can work towards a system that is easier to satisfy. You know, when we think about the epistemic condition of responsibility, when we think about how can we design AI systems so that we can assign responsibility to the people using it. And so they can also take responsibility and work better with the system. And so we might want to have that smooth line. One other thing that's relevant here is then the steepness of the curve. You know, the steeper the curve gets, the greater the difference between different levels of risk. Even if the different levels of risk aren't, you know, very great, but the safety reward might be very different. So I think from a perspective of the epistemic condition of responsibility and our ability to foresee things, we have reasons to avoid excessive steepness at that point. Okay, finally, let's go back to that and think about one final aspect of that function, and that is the turning point here in the middle, when the skateboard ramp turns into the umbrella shape. So when the second derivative turns from positive into negative. And that turning point doesn't need to be where it is right now. We can shift it to the left or to the right. And that is also relevant for different reasons, because the integral of those functions will be a representation of how much emphasis we put on safety as opposed to efficiency. And they will also represent not only this ethical judgment, but also the practical constraint of how many hospital beds that we have. So there is a practical constraint that the integral can't exceed a certain value. So it has to be, let's say, below C. Now, if that sounds kind of plausible to you, maybe you're not the biggest fan of the green line, but you see the differences to the red line, then we come out with that particular sigmoid function. And what I want to say at this point is that if you just see it without the explanation, you might think, this is just math, this is just numbers, it doesn't have anything to do with ethics. But the claim that I want to put to you and discuss with you is that it at least implies a judgment about the relation of 4 central ethical principles. So if you take that as opposed to a linear function or an exponential function, you implicitly make a judgment about the relation between beneficence, responsibility, justice, and the precautionary principle. And so this is maybe a toy example of how deep ethics could work, because what I've tried to do is to start with very general principles, abstract, qualitative, and think about how we might turn them into a mathematical or quantitative description. I didn't do it in the way other scholars have done it in the past, so I didn't think about fairness metrics, where, this was one area, fair machine learning, where people thought about principles of fairness and how they could lead to different fairness metrics, parity, positive, false negatives, and so on. I didn't think about qualis or quantifying life experiences, and I didn't use the methods that philosophers of economics have used. So there are certain parallels to these other areas, but the way I tried to make that step from the qualitative to the quantitative is different, because it's basically through imagining the shapes of the function. So I didn't go straight to the number, but I thought about, do we want to have a convex shape, a concave shape, a straight line, and that eventually in the combination led to the outcome. So it wasn't as atomistic as these other methods, saying we've got one ethical thing, then we translate it. So I tried to use the combination of them, the relation, and then make the step to the function. It also included practical constraints, like a number of hospital beds. And if that's true, then I think it's a new way of making that transition from ethics to those mathematical formulas that could play a role in AI training. And if we're still in the context of making the AI system smart, then we can also see how ethics connects to the development of intelligence, whatever that means. So if you think something in the vicinity of that function, even if it's not exactly like that, is relevant to reinforcement learning, then it is inevitable to make some kind of ethical judgment. So the AI system that we have, where we end up with, might not be a moral agent as we are, and don't want to claim that, but we can't expect it to be ethically neutral. It could be, ethically very bad. Suppose, it's a completely different line that endangers patients greatly, then it would be bad. It could be very good if we end up with a function that reflects our values, but it can't be neutral. We can't find any function that is ethically neutral, and we can't say, let's develop the technology first, make it smart first, and think about the ethics later. It's not just that this is not desirable, it's impossible. And so ethics will be inevitable at that stage. Now, this is just a starting point, maybe for many different applications, but there are also problems that come with that particular approach. And in the next and then also final part of the talk, I want to kind of discuss one key problem with that approach and a suggestion how we might deal with it. And that is the problem that ethics is vague and indeterminate. So there is a certain point where ethics doesn't give us any more specific reasons or guidance how to do things. Due to its abstract and general nature, it lacks a certain kind of precision. So this is a field of controversy within philosophy. So those orthodox Kantians might think there is as much precision in morality as there is in mathematics. Maybe that's true. But I'm going to work on the assumption that, in fact, there is indeterminacy, that sometimes there are pockets of indeterminacy that aren't specific enough. And so this is what it might look like in our example. So depending on how we pick x0, we have the inflection point to the left or to the right. So if it's at 0.5, it would imply the judgment that safety is just as important as efficiency. But if we have it a bit lower, then we might think safety is a bit more than efficiency. But can ethics really guide us beyond the judgment that safety is sometimes more important than efficiency? Can it guide us to a point where it says, well, it should be 0.35 and not 0.36? Questionable. The same with the variable k that controls the steepness of the curve. Well, it might make sense to set it around 15 maybe, to avoid problems with the epistemic condition of responsibility, to avoid making it too steep. But should it be 17 or 13? It's really hard to say. So it seems that even though a combination of ethical principles guide us through one specific type of mathematical function, the concrete parameters and specification of those is not sufficiently determined by those principles. And so here's a famous quote from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So he said, "We must be content in speaking of fine and just actions and of goods in general to indicate the truth roughly. For it is the mark of an educated man, let's say scholar, to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits." So Aristotle thought, well, there are different types of inquiry, areas of inquiry, and we must not push for maximum precision in each of them. Sometimes we can have very precise investigations, very numerically precise descriptions, but in some other areas it might be artificial, wrong-headed, unscholarly, unscientific if we push further than the nature of the subject admits. So it seems that, at least this is what some people thought, when it comes to things like justice, human autonomy, doing good for others, there is a level of specification and precision that we can reach, but there's also a limit to that. And trying to push further and make it look more scientific than the subject actually admits is not a good idea, because it eventually distorts our knowledge and our judgment. Now, that might sound plausible, but the problem in the case is that it seems that in some way or another we need to come up with a more precise number. And I call this the determination gap. It seems that technological practice requires a degree of specificity that ethics cannot provide. So suppose in some way or another we need a reward function that has a particular kind of specification of these variables. They can be the same throughout the training, there can be now a stochastic distribution, but we can't just say we leave it open. I know that there are some methods of trying to leave it open and accommodating vagueness or indeterminacy, but it seems that mostly, and this is a point that I'd like to discuss with you as well, mostly we need to have that kind of specificity. So it's not just, as I started at the beginning, that we have like a divergence between ethics being qualitative and maybe AI requiring more quantitative expressions, but it also seems that we have divergence between indeterminacy and vagueness on the one hand, and determinacy and precision on the other. So suppose we've got that range of variables that ethics guides us to, but we can't really pin it down entirely. So how should we proceed? Is it maybe that we should pick a number at random? So at least since Torek's Do the Numbers Counts paper, philosophers have thought about random procedures of reaching fair outcomes, maybe flipping a coin to give everyone an equal chance in an allocation of scarce goods, or just using it as a procedure. So the idea that if we can't really agree on what's substantively the right outcome, maybe we can have a procedure where everything is taken into account. But I think there is something deficient in that view when we think about AI training. I mean, first of all, in practice, it might be really difficult to have genuinely random or randomized procedure. The worry is, of course, that what is declared as a randomized procedure embodies structural injustices or biases in certain kind of ways of picking and controlling the training of AI systems. It might not be genuinely random, but again perpetuate the biases that we've known in our society and in AI in particular. This is a practical, maybe a contingent problem. In an ideal world, it might not exist if you can really guarantee that. But the more fundamental and philosophical problem is that when we deal with things like hospital beds or safety in mobility, philosophers in the contractualist camp in particular emphasize that we want to have an interpersonal justification to those affected. We don't want just to say, we picked a number at random. It might make a huge difference to your life. It might be a life and death decision, or we don't really have an explanation to you. This is just, a random procedure. So the thought is that there's something that, we owe other people when our conduct affects them in these very fundamental ways, when it might make a difference whether they are admitted to the hospital or not. So there is a moral requirement to provide an adequate justification, an interpersonal justification in the sense of addressing their standpoint, their needs, and the things that they might reasonably reject or reasonably agree on. And that is not possible when we think about picking a number at random. So I want to suggest a different way of approaching the question, how we kind of make that precise. And the idea might sound a bit weird or outlandish at first, and this is creating precision when there is none. And I'll start from a completely different area within philosophy to introduce the idea. Or maybe take a step back and think about how philosophers have thought about rationality more generally. So for a very long time, the pursuit of rationality was about responding to the reasons that there are. So as a rational agent, we discover the world and we respond to moral reasons that there are. We didn't really shape them. They are in some way there or not. There are different meta-ethics behind it. So some people think, moral truth or moral principles are like principles of physics. They're just out there in the world, independent of our minds. Whereas other things think that they are constructed out of our either individual starting points or societal conventions. It doesn't really matter, but in any case, we couldn't just decide what the moral reasons are. We're just responding to them. And being rational means being capable of acting on those reasons, seeing what they are, and aligning one's conduct. Things like also from instrumental rationality to the categorical imperative. It's about discovery. Now that at some point things changed and people thought, well, maybe being rational can also mean creating reasons. Not just discovering them, but also creating them. And the literature in early modern political philosophy, contractualism, up to the moral philosophy in the normative powers had this idea. So here's an everyday example of how it might work. So again, suppose you go to see a doctor, a medical doctor, your dentist, and it's about whether or not you should get a dental procedure. They can't just take you and perform the procedure on you. That would be assault and obviously illegal. But if you give your consent and you say, yes, I permit that, that's okay, it's a completely different thing. Now it becomes permissible. You turned a procedure from legally, morally, clearly impermissible to permissible just by say so. And think about it, this is magic. You created a permission that didn't exist before. So when we think about what it means to be a moral agent, a rational agent, that is a case that shows it's not just about responding to reasons that exist independent of human activity, but sometimes we can create reasons to perform a dental procedure, create a permission. So philosophers call this a normative power. So this is our ability to change the moral and legal situation just by declaration. Another example is giving a promise. So if you give a promise to help your friend move houses, you create an obligation for yourself that did not exist before. You say, I hereby promise to do this or that, creates a new obligation, a new strong reason for you to do something that did not exist before. So what happens here? You're not just responding to the reasons that there are in the universe, but you're actively shaping them. And again, this is a normative power. So it is an instance where just by say-so or declaration, you change something. And we have these cases all the time. So we're consenting, promising, signing a contract. And so this is a different idea of thinking about what we ought to do and moral reason. It's not just passive in the sense of, just responding to things that there are already, but it has a more active sense to it, where it's all about creating those reasons. So how about we use that idea to think about the reinforcement learning example, where the thing that we create in the end, so we have the the interval where ethical principles guide us, but the specific value would have to come about by the exercise of a normative power. So some kind of normative power that just by committing to a particular numerical value makes it the right value. So this is, again, a very, maybe unusual idea, so give it some time to sink in. But the idea would be that it's a form of commitment that happens here. A commitment to a particular configuration of those principles, to a very specific numerical value that then makes it the right way to go. It's not the right option independent of our activity of developing and using AI, but it only becomes the right option via a commitment. So what does that commitment mean? It is an act, I think, of taking responsibility for that thing. It is an act where we say, okay, we commit to that and we make it appropriate for others to hold us to account, to ask us for those reasons. So first of all, it's a form of answerability. And it's an interesting way of avoiding responsibility gaps there. So if you only had a stochastic distribution or random procedure, let's say, pick any random number within the interval that you want, we might again end up with responsibility gaps because what's happening in the system has too loose a connection to our reasoning or agency. But if we can think of it as an act of commitment and taking responsibility, things are quite different. The difficult question here, I think, or one of the difficult questions is how we might think about who ought to exercise that normative power. Should it be just the one person deploying the AI system? Should it be maybe the people developing the AI system or a larger community? And I think the most promising application is to think of it as a collective normative power. So the examples that I gave you with consenting and promising were mostly about individual normative powers. So I, as an individual, consent to my dental treatment. I, as a friend, promise to do this or that. But with the AI system, where there are so many people involved and it also has societal relevance, we need to conceptualize the specification of these metrics as a collective normative power. So that means that ultimately the development of the technology has this societal or even political component that we must not ignore for the sake of avoiding responsibility gaps and making sure that we understand what role ethics plays. And there are different ways of doing that in practice. Maybe there is a voting procedure, maybe there ought to be stakeholder engagement in different ways. So there are, I think, a couple of models that could work in practice. But the important point is that this is, an area where human involvement remains key. So when we think about what is it that we could, maybe delegate to technology, to AI systems, and what's not really capable of being delegated, and I think this is a core aspect. Because an AI system cannot exercise a normative power. We might be able, to delegate many things to AI systems, but an AI system cannot consent, cannot promise, and cannot do any of these other things because it is not a moral agent, at least not at the moment, and maybe it'll never be. You could have, an AI system as a proxy, acting for you, maybe preparing the contract or doing these things, but when we think about what kind of being or agent is capable of exercising a normative power, right now it's just us humans. And if the exercise of a normative power is like the important final step in things like reinforcement learning, then we need to recognize that this is us. It's not the AI, it's us. Wasn't that the motto? And so we might, cover it up and say, oh, just automate it and some things chosen there. But that is theoretically wrong. What happens there is, in essence, the exercise of a normative power. It is an act of commitment, of taking responsibility, and we could ignore it in practice, but that doesn't mean it goes away. And this is the responsibility of the humans. Now, I already, showed you one very unusual idea. And this is this normative power of taking responsibility. It has not been recognized in the literature on responsibility that might ever be possible. So this is my position that I put to you. I have one more qualification that I need to make about responsibility and how we think about it that is equally unusual, and that is the idea that if we think there's an act of taking responsibility is strict, and I want to say a little bit about what that means. If you're interested, I defended this idea at length in my paper in ethics last year, strict moral answerability. So the way philosophers think about responsibility normally is that you can only be responsible for things that have a strong or sufficiently strong connection to your quality of will. So they call it quality of will. And that could mean things like your judgment, your regard for the interest of others, or your quality of character, really. But there needs to be a strong link. And if that link between you as a moral agent and the outcome is kind of disconnected, then you can't be responsible anymore. Now with the AI system, that becomes a challenge because our moral agency, the things that we directly control and manipulate, they become increasingly disconnected from how the system works in the end and the outcome. And this is why many people thought, not just for reasons of control, but also from that quality of will account, there are responsibility gaps because the disconnect is only going to rise and becoming greater. Now, the idea to say that responsibility is strict is basically to deny the requirement that responsibility requires the connection to the quality of will. So if, let's say, you harm someone out of mere bad luck, you drive a car, you're a completely diligent driver, you do everything one could possibly expect it to do, but out of bad luck, you hit someone and they break their leg. Now, the quality of will theorists might say you're not genuinely morally responsible in that case, in that idealized case. If you were not negligent or reckless, you're not responsible. You might be causally involved. Maybe there's a legal obligation to pay, but that's all there is, with no moral responsibility. Now, the account of strict responsibility that I propose has a different view. It says, yes, you are genuinely morally responsible. Why? Because there are two conditions. So one, you were causally involved in the thing, and you had an obligation to guard against that kind of risk. You know, whenever we get into a car, we know that's a kind of risk that could materialize, and we ought to guard against it. It doesn't really matter whether it reflects anything about your regard for others, whether it reflects, you know, your diligence or whatever. It just matters that you did it, and you had a forward-looking responsibility, an obligation to guard against it. I'm not saying it's an obligation to make sure it will never happen. You know, that's out of our control. But at least an obligation to guard against it. And we have certain kind of areas where we do have those obligations because we know there are certain risks associated with the activity. When I get into the car, I know there can be a traffic accident. When I walk on the street, I know there's a risk of bumping into people. When I dance with someone else, I have to look out not to step on their toes. There are other scenarios where, you know, harm could happen, you know, out of the blue, and I couldn't know, and my account wouldn't apply to those. So in philosophy, Judith Jarvis Thomson has the case where someone comes home, flicks the light switch, and then through some deviant causal chain, there's an explosion at the other end of the city or in the neighboring house, and then someone gets burned. And in that case, I would say, you know, you could never have, you know, known that that would happen. You don't have an obligation to guard against explosions whenever you come home and flick on the light switch. So in that case, you wouldn't be responsible. But in other cases, like driving a car, developing an AI for a hospital, you have that obligation because you know those risks. You know what the risks are of unnecessary hospitalization, of no hospitalization when it's needed. And so the responsibility bar is basically lower, and that makes the idea of, you know, just taking responsibility and committing to it easier. Because if responsibility would require this huge connection to our moral character or quality of will, then it would be a non-starter from the very beginning. So a corollary of my idea of having this commitment and creating precision when there is none is to think about responsibility in a different way. And in fact, this idea of strict responsibility is something that the law recognizes in different forms across the board, but philosophy has never really taken up. So in the book that Eva mentioned at the beginning, I try to connect those two different areas and support a hypothesis that I call the legal lead. So the idea that by investigating selected aspects of legal responsibility, we can learn something about moral responsibility and not just the other way around. Normally philosophers are, let's say, very self-confident, and they say, we're going to tell the lawyers how things are. But the legal history is a very interesting history, you know, condensed wisdom through so many cases. And so what I try to do in the book is to, you know, recover that treasure and make it available within philosophical frameworks. And one payoff is the talk for the day, where we have a type of responsibility that we can negotiate, take on, commit to without this other baggage. And that other baggage, the quality of will accounts, that basically came into the discussion because philosophers weren't really concerned for a long time with practical cases, but with determinism and free will. That was the main discussion area. If there's determinism, could we ever have free will? And so they developed their theory from that perspective. Whereas the lawyers were mostly concerned with, paying compensation and locking people up. Okay, so this is the idea of responsibility that stands behind it. So let me wrap it up and again summarize what I wanted to put to your scrutiny today. So I started with a well-known idea of ethics by design. The idea that ethics must not be an afterthought, but be integrated in the development of AI. Many people have written about it, very useful ways, but I think I wanted to push it a bit further in two ways. By suggesting a new way of making the transition from principles that seem very qualitative into things that are a bit more quantitative, more amenable to machine learning techniques. And second, by doing so, suggesting that there's a very interesting connection between ethics and intelligence, and call this deep ethics. And through the reinforcement learning example, I wanted to show that whatever you do, in some way or another, you will imply a judgment about 4 ethical principles. You can't avoid it. Either you emphasize one more than the other, but you can't really avoid it. So ethics is not just desirable in an ethics by design framework. It is, in fact, inevitable, and inevitable into making those systems smart. So I started at the beginning of the talk by saying, look at how we grow up. We're not just like super smart at age 10, then morality kicks in. But little kids have this sense of fairness and justice when they interact with others. And it seems that there's a co-development of ethical sensitivity and intelligence. And I think that is true of machine intelligence as well. So that there's yet another parallel maybe between a neuroscientific perspective on human learning and a machine learning perspective on how systems get smart. I gave you that problem at the end where ethics isn't really precise enough to give us all that we might need, and suggested that this is, again, a place for us humans to shine. It's not the AI, it's us, where we can exercise a normative power and commit to that, making us accountable. And that requires a new way of thinking about responsibility. So interestingly, this is I think a philosophical insight that is relevant way beyond the AI application. So just as Lee Sedol said he thinks differently about creativity after interacting with the AI, I think differently about responsibility after kind of going through those examples. And I think this is what makes these technological developments so interesting for a traditional philosopher like myself as well, because it might change how we think about very fundamental notions of human experience and agency. And I want to hear a bit more from you as well, so I close at this point, and thanks very much for your attention.